Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all, Canada's most irreverent talk show here, the Andrew Lawton Show on True North on this Thursday, May 30th. As I mentioned earlier this week, I'm actually on my book tour right now. Today I will be, or I should say this evening, I will be speaking in Toronto at the Albany Club. Very good opportunity to discuss my latest book, Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. So we decided to make some shows for you that focus on the bigger picture questions, not necessarily the news of the day, but the big picture questions about where we are as a society, as a civilization, and crucially, where we are going. Now, my guest for today's episode, I spoke to on the show a while back when he was launching a university course in wokeness. Now, at a certain point, we all have to understand our enemy to defeat it. And this guy literally wrote the book on wokeness. It was just released. It's called The Third Awokening. And Professor Eric Kaufmann joins me now. Eric, good to talk to you again. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So why did you decide to just jump headfirst with everything you've got into the world of wokeness with this book?
Well, the first thing to say is there is a lot of attention on this idea. I mean, since 2015, if you look at what's been in the news, it's just exploded in terms of interest. And of course, we've had a surge in cancellations, professors being fired, speakers being no platformed. And of course, terms like white privilege have soared in major newspapers like the New York Times and Washington Post. So there was this big phenomenon which Matthew Iglesias dubbed the Great Awakening. Now, there's been almost no academic research into this. It's quite uncomfortable terrain for a lot of academics. And so I just think this is an ideology that really needed to be examined as an ideology like any other, analytically, and then to ask really where this is going.
Yeah, and I should say your book is it's academic in terms of its research, but it's very readable and very attainable as well for, I think, a lay audience, which is important because we're seeing that there has been this widespread infiltration of wokeness, not just into the academy, but literally every area of civil society, I think. And I wanted to ask you that as a starting point. Is there anywhere that right now you've seen that is immune to this?
God, I think you can see very few institutions, certain police department, not in Britain where in fact they've gone in for this, but if you take like the New York Police Department, I'm guessing certain institutions, the Navy SEALs, I don't know, perhaps there are a few institutions, there are certain companies, ExxonMobil perhaps, very few places that were not affected by this surge. Now, it is true that there are a few institutions, like a few companies like Coinbase, for example, others that have walked it back, like Netflix. And so we can see certainly a retreat in some corporate settings from the DEI high watermark of sort of 2020, 2021. But very few sectors were not affected by this. It's worth saying, by the way, Andrew, that we can track the mention of terms, even a term like racism, sexism, or homophobia, or transphobia. We can track that through academic abstracts and through newspaper stories. And the story that kind of big data analysis tells is that these terms were already being used and studied very intensively on campus prior to the 2010s. So in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. What happens in the mid-2010s, however, is they spill out of the campus and get into the mass media, and from there into the youth culture, into the mass culture, into the institutions in a big way. So that really is something I think I would attribute to the spread of social media, which connects academics and journalists, and then also a new media model emphasizing virality on Twitter.
You call this phenomenon cultural socialism. Explain what that is.
Well, so basically woke, I have a one-sentence definition of woke, which is making sacred historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identities. Once you make those sacred, you then have no toleration for any inequality between those identity groups. So any race gaps, gender gaps, for example, are no longer acceptable. So that's sort of now with economic socialism, it was any gaps between individuals or classes that were no longer acceptable. With cultural socialism, it's any sort of gaps in terms of desired social goods between identity groups that are no longer acceptable. So the aim is really to have a sort of leveling up through quotas, typically affirmative action quotas. Now, we could imagine a kind of cultural socialism working on the lines of intelligence or looks or athleticism. That is really the subject of, to some degree, Lionel Shriver's new book, Mania, which is really about, having an equal outcome between people with low intelligence and high intelligence. It's kind of dystopia. But in this case, in the case that I'm talking about, it's mainly about equal outcomes between racial groups and then also sexual and gender identity groups.
There is at its core an ability to take aim at wokeism or cultural socialism on, I think, moral grounds. It is just inherently wrong to divide the world this way, irrespective of the consequences. But what I found fascinating, and you have a whole chapter devoted to this, material consequences, is that it doesn't even achieve the aims that the purveyors of it set out to do. It doesn't even fix the problems that they claim they're fixing. I mean, at best, it has no impact in their direction. At worst, and I'd say more commonly, it works against them. And you talk about this in two ways, which I found interesting. But the second of which is that it basically hollows out the moderates of society. And I was wondering if you could extrapolate on that a bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first part, I use a few examples. So, for example, if you think, what impact did the Black Lives Matter protests have on Black neighborhoods, both in terms of businesses destroyed, property damage to Black businesses? What's the effect going to be on those neighborhoods? How many Black people were killed additionally as a result of this? And what is on the plus side? It's very difficult to enumerate. That's just one example of how now, and actually Shelby Steele, who influenced me, who's an African-American conservative writer, he argues that a lot of these policies are just virtue signaling, often from liberal whites who want to show that they're not the bad whites. Actually, there's very little concern with what this is going to do to achievement for the particular group concerned. And so, yeah, I think that one of the downstream effects, if you like, is this damages the life chances of the very groups that progressives claim to want to help. We can see something similar on the indigenous issue. I mean, if you're encouraging a culture of dependency, if you're not really tackling the root problems of what's driving some of the social issues on reservations, for example, then you're not solving the problem. And we can say this about education. If you won't exclude pupils because there happen to be certain racial groups that are excluded more from class for bad behavior, actually you're going to damage the potential. Particularly, and if we take the U.S. example, Black students who may want to learn are going to be prevented from learning if you have unruly students that are not excluded. So these are just a few examples. And of course, what this does also is it drives polarization. So it damages the very groups that are supposedly to be helped, but it also alienates other groups. So another example would be affirmative action, which misallocates students to universities. So it will put students who have lower SAT scores than required for, say, a physics course at MIT into MIT when they should be at a good but not very top university. And so they wind up dropping out of those courses at higher rates and not fulfilling their potential, or switching to, sociology or Africana studies or other courses that are not going to get them the kind of earnings that they would like to have. At the same time, it kind of irritates those who missed out on a spot because they were the wrong color, and that drives a kind of polarization. It becomes a political issue. So what this does is it sort of stokes resentment amongst majority communities or dominant communities, and it fails to actually help minority communities. So I guess in terms of human flourishing and so the societal good, I see a lot of negativity there.
Yeah, and it feeds into what you've called here quite aptly a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then it just, continues the problems, furthers the problems. And at the end of it, no one is really interested in breaking this cycle and say, oh, well, maybe there's an inherent flaw with what we're trying to do here. I wanted to delve beyond that a little bit, because this is where you have, I think, a tendency for a lot of people to say everything is the responsibility of this one power dynamic that they see. And I would say in the context of October 7th, this is where we see just horrific things done in the name of viewing the world through that oppressor-oppressed dichotomy only. You quote the Black writer Kendi, who says, when he looks at any inequality, he sees it as being a consequence of racism. And that's a very, very dangerous belief system, because he's already diagnosed the cause of any phenomenon he identifies that he doesn't like.
Right. Well, yeah, it's circular reasoning because the cause is built into the effect and vice versa. So if you say, well, any disparity is because of discrimination, you wouldn't say, for example, that if Jews are doing better than Gypsy and Irish travelers, for example, that's a result of Jews discriminating. I mean, we wouldn't apply this to, or Seventh Day Adventists don't earn as much as Episcopalians. We wouldn't apply this to other categories, but somehow we feel that on the sacred categories, um, race, gender, and sexuality, that any kind of disparity is evidence of quote unquote systemic discrimination. That could be white supremacy, it could be patriarchy, or some other structure that we somehow can't measure independently of the disparity, and so we can't actually make a causal statement. And so, yeah, you get this spurious reasoning. The other thing I would say is, in addition to positing that any kind of disparity is evidence of some kind of systemic bias and discrimination, which can only be cured through some kind of affirmative action policy, there's also this hypersensitivity aspect. So the two elements of this kind of fuzzy ideology are, one, equal outcomes for the sacred groups, and secondly, hypersensitivity to the group such that any speech which offends even the most sensitive member of such a group is a form of blasphemy. And so anyone who utters that speech, it could just be something as simple as mispronouncing someone's surname, anything like that becomes grounds for the charge of racism and for cancellation, kind of excommunication, because you've profaned a sacred group by insulting that group. What that means is this is a profound threat to free speech, for example, and the pursuit of truth. I mean, I'll use an example from Canada. Can we actually pursue truth on something such as the so-called mass graves and Kamloops? Well, if that's seen as offensive to members of a particular minority group, the argument from woke is that those sensitivities come before truth. Or similarly, if you believe that a woman is biologically female, biological males cannot be called a woman, that too, again, truth is subsumed beneath sensitivity. So this is really the dilemma that we find ourselves in.
There's a fascinating dilemma you touch on here, which is the unwillingness in many cases for conventional conservative parties to tackle these issues. And part of that is for good reason. When conservatives do talk about these things, they're accused of stoking the flames of the culture war, of being divisive, of doing all of this. But you make a bold claim here, which I wanted to, and I really tried before speaking to you to come up with a counterpoint to disprove this. And I have not yet been able to, although I do have some questions about it. You say political change on culture war issues can only come from right-wing parties. If they succeed in making left-wing parties pay an electoral price for doing the bidding of progressive activists, this will empower the materialist center-left against the influential young cultural socialists. So I think you're broadly right there, but I guess where I was trying to find a weakness in the argument is that I thought that the path might come from the galvanization by the left of itself, and that it would be the J.K. Rowling types, for example, the anti-woke leftists that have more political power in this, in a sense, because they're part of the left-wing coalition.
Well, I think, how would I say? I mean, what I think is that the mass of the left, the sort of liberal left, who comprise the largest share of the left, are just very sensitive to charge taboos around racism, sexism, transphobia, and they really don't want to be on the wrong side of that. That's the first thing. But it's not just fear. There is also the components of their worldview are largely about guilt over forms of past or present inequality and discrimination, and secondly, a kind of compassion for specific minority groups. And any claim that's made in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion of these groups is something that they are going to be very attracted to. And so a Rowling, for example, is not necessarily going to be accepted. Her claims are not going to be easily accepted by the left, most of whom want to remain on side and who want to sort of see themselves as good people, by which they mean people who are allies to minorities. And so I don't believe the left can reform itself, actually. I think we have an example of that to some degree in universities, which have had a problem with speech codes and free speech violation for certainly since the first speech codes came in in the late 1980s and have almost all been struck down as unconstitutional in the US context. But still, universities have just not been able to reform themselves on free speech. Unfortunately, I believe it's the case that unless there's an incentive coming from outside, that there is probably a group that's biddable, but they need to be able to point to some external force and to say, look, if we don't want the government clamping down on us, we're going to have to get rid of our speech codes and start defending free speech, for example, on campus. Without being able to point to that, they're liable to be seen as either traitors or insensitive to minority groups, and I just don't think the bulk are willing. And I have survey data on that, which would show, for example, if you look at academics today in Canada, the US, Australia, Britain, by a 2-to-1 margin, roughly, they support mandatory diversity statements. That's something they support. It is only when there's pressure coming from the media and from politicians that they may decide, as has occurred in a few universities, to abandon these things. If it were just up to them, do I think they would abandon them? No. There just simply is too much support for them within. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stick with the incentives model.
I'm curious about your perspective on a couple of aspects of this, but one of them is how, or if you fear there's an overreaction problem that can come from the right. And one example of this, and you touch on this in your book, that the old does the gay baker or does the Christian baker have to make the gay wedding cake question? And I think the standard resistance we saw to that cultural imperative from the right was private business. They can do what they want. They can do what they want. It was an appeal to that libertarian idea of personal choice. I also saw, during COVID, people on the right say businesses should not be allowed as private businesses to have a vaccine passport, for example, because the point that I made was that if an individual business wants to do that, that's its right. And I used the Christian Baker worldview that I had on that. And you had some people on the right that say, no, they shouldn't have the right to do that. And part of the trend that I've identified, and I'm curious if you see this, is that there are some people, not all, that want to use the same institutional power and levers that the left uses against them, rather than sticking to that initial libertarian premise.
Well, yeah, and this opens up a big debate, right, between libertarians and other kinds of conservatives. I'm kind of with you on the examples you just cited. But I think, so for example, I think probably many of us would support the Civil Rights Act, this idea that you can't discriminate on the basis of race if you are offering a public service, for example, refusing to serve a black customer or hire a woman or something of this nature. Now, true free associationists would say, no, if you really want to hire all men and you don't want to hire anything but whites, you should be allowed to do that. I'm sort of more on the side of saying, well, for certain characteristics, I think it's reasonable to have equality law.
But while that may be morally right, it's also intellectually inconsistent.
Well, I think you can sort of draw a line, and you can have kind of a happy medium. I'm kind of a utilitarian in some ways, so I sort of believe in these optimal points. I think you can have, on certain characteristics, it should be free association. On other characteristics, I think that you can insist on non-discrimination. But you're right, and it depends. I mean, I think if you have a Catholic club or a Catholic church, you can restrict it to Catholics only. And I think there's nothing wrong with all male clubs either. By the way, that if this is part of the function of the club, is if that is germane to the. And there have been a number of court cases that have established when you can discriminate. You can have Chinese cooks and waiters in a Chinese restaurant, but you can't have, an all Chinese only policy of hiring at a bank, for example. So I think that this is something that the judges have come up with a certain happy medium on. Where that line is, I'm not. What I would say though is I think that, increasingly in Britain and in Europe, we have this view that philosophical belief is now a protected characteristic. So firing somebody because they say that a biological male is not a woman, cannot be a woman, is no longer permitted. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I would support. I mean, I think that I do support to some degree the use of these protected characteristics if you're offering a public service and if the mission of your organization is not specific to that particular characteristic, like a Chinese restaurant, for example, which would be justified in hiring Chinese only, I think is different if you are a bank. You can't just hire Democrats, for example.
So where do we go from here then? Because we have agreed, if we accept your premise, that any political change has to come from the right. But there has been, I mean, the US Republican Party is one example where they've been relatively unafraid in many areas of going after critical race theory and gender ideology. The UK Tories periodically find a spine. It's not long lasting, but they do it. The Canadian Conservatives have perennially been challenged by not wanting to go near these issues at all. By saying, no, we're just going to talk about lower taxes and this and that. And you know, at a certain point, I do think it's changing now. Pierre Poilievre has obviously had more of a willingness than his predecessors to engage on these issues. Rishi Sunak, I think, tends to cosplay as a culture warrior at times. And as long as he just keeps doing that, I guess, you know, maybe the right things will happen. But do you think this will be long lasting? Do you think there is a legitimate political opposition to this right now?
Yeah, I absolutely think it is, and this is where I contest the arguments of some who are more pessimistic on this front, or perhaps, I mean, people like Yoram Hazonian to some degree. Well, if we just stick with Hazonian, people who say liberalism has failed, liberal democracy has failed, we have to move to a post-liberal dispensation. I don't believe that. I think within liberal democracy, there's a lot we can do. And I think, for example, I think that the education system has to be a focus. I just think it's intolerable to allow an institution which brings up the next generation to indoctrinate those children into cultural socialism, for example. So whether that be critical race, radical gender ideology, just the sort of ethos in the classroom, I think, is shaping the worldview of another generation. So that really needs to be much more of a focus. And I think it will become more of a focus in Canada. I think this has only really just begun in the US, really in the last few years. And I think it's already bringing results. And I think it's entirely legitimate at the K to 12 level. The universities are more complicated. But yeah, I think that the Canadian Conservatives have really only just dipped their toe in the water, and there's far more that needs to be done on this. And also, I think part of it, as we discussed earlier, it's not just, you know, battles over cancel culture on campus or a bit of DEI in the civil service. I mean, this has actually has huge implications for, let's say, Canada as a country or the West as a civilization. You know, if you can't have an even-handed discussion of national identity because you have a myth about genocide against the Indigenous taking place in residential schools, for example, and it's all about sort of shredding your national past, you'll have nothing for a population to unite around. And so what you'll get is sort of one side, like Trudeau, pushing we're going to have no identity, we're going to be post-national, and we're going to basically damn all of our past as nothing but white supremacy. If that's sort of your attitude, then I think you're heading into a highly polarized climate, which just makes all policymaking more difficult. And not to mention, by the way, all of the impacts, the downstream effects on educational performance, healthcare, crime, immigration, all of these issues, which if we can't discuss them properly, if they're surrounded by red lines and sacred cows, we're just not going to be able to attain the kind of progress we want. And that's kind of why sort of one of the points in the book is really that we have a kind of choice between cultural socialism and cultural flourishing. Just the way we had a choice in the Cold War between economic socialism, which was about some kind of perfect equality, leveling things down, and immiserization. And so we're heading towards a kind of cultural immiserization, and we really have to find a way of sort of making sound moral arguments that would push back against that.
One of the chapters you explore considerably in the book, and it actually times with when we're having this interview, is the residential schools debate in Canada. Now, this is the third anniversary of the claim of hundreds of unmarked graves, for which there has been no further advancing of that claim beyond what was made 3 years ago. And when you talk about sacred cows, this is probably the most acute and illustrative example in Canada of an issue in which all of the things that we would do of any other claims of this nature have not happened and will not happen. And while there's been a little bit more of an openness by the media to ask some of these questions, it's still relatively confined in scope to people I could list and count on one hand in Canadian media. And I was curious if you could just take your thoughts on wokeness or cultural socialism in general and apply that to this debate in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's sort of prime example. It's almost Exhibit A, even more than the George Floyd moment in the U.S. That what you have here is sensitivity um, to not offending a particular sacred group, and it's sort of the mainstream society that's made them sacred, actually. But an unwillingness to offend that group is more important than truth, is more important than freedom of expression, for example. And this is a perfect illustration of that particular trade-off. And what it obscures is what Jonathan Rauch at the Brookings Institute calls the truth-based order. And what we've seen is on the gender issue, some of the politicians are now willing to challenge claims around truth around gender, for example, and to actually start to push back a little bit on the trans activist position. So we've seen Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan and Danielle Smith in Alberta, although we haven't seen Premier Ford in Ontario. But what we haven't seen any of is a willingness to actually challenge the national narrative that's been installed by the left and through the Indigenous residential schools question. And in fact, there were people on the left who sort of were saying after George Floyd that we would love to have something like a George Floyd moment, and this provided it. It provides power to the left to deconstruct the established Canadian national identity. So I guess the question for the political class, we have seen some in the media, yourself, True North, has been immensely important in this. The National Post has been important in this. But what we haven't seen is any sort of willingness among the political class to actually now start to say, we made a mistake. Actually, truth is important. Actually, national cohesion and identity is important. And we are actually going to take a stand. And I think the public will be behind them because, as I showed, I mean, in this survey that I conducted for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Canadians by a 2-to-1 margin do not want Sir John A. Macdonald's statues to be removed. They support the existing narrative of national identity, and they don't like what's happening. So I think if some politicians had the courage, as on the gender issue, to make the first move, who is going to be the Blaine Higgs on the residential schools question in Canadian politics? I think whoever does make that move is going to find a lot of support. Now, if they continue to not have the courage to do that, I think I can't see where Canada avoids growing deep in polarization, because without a unifying narrative which unifies the past and the present, there's just no way to build the cohesion, particularly in a country that has increasing numbers of splits, large-scale immigration, without anything to assimilate into. I think Canada's headed for trouble.
So, as we conclude on this topic in general, let me ask you, Eric, about the motivation question, because I do believe, and perhaps I'm overly naive, that there are people that genuinely believe they are doing something important. They're not motivated by hatred. They genuinely believe that there is racism, sexism, whatever phobias, and that this is a way to respond to that. I also believe there are people that very cynically want control. They want to control society. They want to control the debate. They want to use this tool to achieve a particular political outcome. There are probably other stages along the way there, but what's the breakdown? How many of the operatives of this cultural socialism, to use your term, are pure of heart, if you will?
Well, I actually think it is higher. Well, when I say pure of heart, I think most of them genuinely believe it. And I say that because I've conducted surveys, for example, of academic faculty, but also of the wider public. And if we just take the academic faculty, for example, no one's looking over their shoulder to see whether they tick the right box, and they're still expressing, as I mentioned, 2-to-1 support for mandatory diversity statements. They support political correctness by a margin of almost 4-to-1. I think there is this. What's happened is you've had a number of layers. This idea of equality of outcome for identity groups. This view that there just should be an even distribution across male, female, across white, non-white in desired occupations. And if we haven't got that, there's something wrong. I just don't think that's questioned by a lot of left liberals, not the cultural Marxist radicals, but the left liberal group, which I really think is the key group. And similarly, when it comes to sensitivity, there's no real firewall on how sensitive we should be. It's always more. And I think just these kinds of basic impulses have really driven attitudes amongst this group. And so I don't think it's cynical power manipulation. Really, I really think it is genuine belief. And this gets down to kind of a point that Jonathan Haidt makes, and Greg Lukianoff, this idea of always trust your feelings. People feel these moral emotions, which is what guides them, but they don't actually question where those moral emotions stem from. And those emotions really stem from a cultural learning process and an ideological process, which I don't think a lot of left-leaning Westerners have really examined. And I think if they do examine them, they'll realize that there is sort of when it comes to culture, left liberalism, the progressivism doesn't really have any limits, any guardrails. It does on economics. I think there's a check. Left liberals believe in the free market. They also believe in state intervention, and they believe in a mixed capitalist dispensation. But when it comes to culture, there's just an unbounded desire for more equity, more inclusion, more diversity. And I don't think they've really thought through that those things have overshot the optimum. And I think that's what we're living through, is a kind of overshooting of the optimum on a lot of these progressive values, and how we come back from that, I think, will be the story really of the coming decades.
The book offers a very cogent diagnosis, but also a 12-point plan, as the subtitle says, for rolling back progressive extremism. So for people that feel very consumed by this, people that feel very overwhelmed by this, what's the first step?
Well, the first step, I believe, is actually that conservative politicians need to raise the salience of this issue. This issue has to become more important for conservative parties and politicians. And if that means that you may not be able to spend as much time talking about economics and foreign policy, I actually think this is an absolutely central issue for voters as well. That has to come first, and then government, which is the only institution that the sort of 2/3 majority that isn't woke in Canada or the US or Britain, that is the only institution they can hope to control. And what that means is the elected government is going to have to reform all of the institutions, schools, for example, the civil service, even the selection of the judiciary has to become something where there's more attention paid to cultural ramifications. What are the flags and emblems flown on government buildings on public property? All of that has to become, I think, more important, because it's as if, I use the example of, imagine every flag in Canada was changed to the Chinese flag. And you could say it doesn't matter because things would go on as usual. Nothing really would be affected materially. But this is a massive shift, right? And none of us would question that. And yet, somehow, when we change the ethos in our institutions, in the schools, that's not seen as a big deal. Just focus on the economic, the healthcare, etc. I think that's a mistake. And I think that there has to be more attention now paid to neglected cultural issues by conservatives. And that's really where this starts. And hopefully, we'll see with Polyev. Hopefully, this is the beginning of that change.
The book, The Third Awokening, a 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism. The author, the Canadian-born professor, Eric Kaufmann. Eric, good to talk to you. Thanks so much, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks as always, Andrew.
All right, all the best to you. That does it for us for today. We will be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. Back in the studio, this is The Andrew Lawton Show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.